He was the king of rock and roll, worshipped on stage, idolized by millions, and adored by women across the globe. But behind the spotlight, behind the jumpsuits and screaming fans, Elvis Presley's love life told a very different story. What happens when a man belongs to the world, but pieces of his heart are left with the women who tried to love him? From a teenage Priscilla locked in Graceland's golden cage, to the fiery Ann-Margret who nearly changed his future. From Linda Thompson's quiet heartbreak to Ginger Alden's final haunting moment. This is the story of those who stood closest to the flame. Some were forgotten, some were blamed, but all of them carried his shadow long after the music stopped. This is not just a tale of romance. It's a story of devotion, control, grief, and the cost of loving a legend. Priscilla Beaulieu. In 1959, a 14-year-old girl met the most famous man on earth. Priscilla Beaulieu was living in West Germany, the daughter of a U.S. Air Force officer. Elvis Presley, 10 years older and already a global icon, was serving in the army. Their first meeting was almost innocent. Small talk at a party, polite charm. But beneath the surface, something more intense was beginning. Elvis was instantly captivated by her delicate looks and soft-spoken nature. And Priscilla? She was swept up into a world she never imagined. Over the next few years, their long-distance relationship was nurtured through letters, carefully arranged visits, and endless emotional control. Elvis kept tabs on everything: what she wore, who she spoke to, what music she listened to. When he invited her to live in Memphis at 17, Priscilla was told she'd finish high school there under the Presleys' watch. But in truth, she was entering a world where Elvis would shape every detail of her life. Graceland was a mansion, but it quickly became a gilded cage. Priscilla later revealed how isolated she felt. Elvis, who was often away touring or filming, insisted she remain untouched, physically and emotionally, as he pursued other women. She was molded to be the perfect silent partner, elegant, obedient, and loyal. "I was Elvis's living doll," she once said. "He told me what to do, how to dress, how to behave." When the marriage finally ended in 1973, after 6 years, Priscilla walked away with heartbreak, but also with freedom. She took that pain and turned it into power. She founded Elvis Presley Enterprises, turned Graceland into a cultural empire, and raised their daughter, Lisa Marie, with strength. "I had to find out who I was," Priscilla said later. "I had to break out and discover me." And she did. While Priscilla became the wife the world knew, another woman almost rewrote the story. She met Elvis on a film set and nearly stole both his heart and his future. Ann-Margret. In 1963, sparks flew on the set of Viva Las Vegas. Elvis had never met a woman quite like Ann-Margret, fiery, playful, and just as famous in her own right. They shared an electric chemistry that jumped off the screen and exploded behind the scenes. She was Swedish-American, beautiful and bold, and she matched him beat for beat in confidence. Elvis called her his soulmate in mischief. Together, they were wild, inseparable, and in love. Unlike Priscilla, Ann-Margret didn't need saving. She had her own career, her own fans, and her own ambitions. And that made her a problem for Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's controlling manager. Parker feared she would ruin Elvis's clean image and distract him from his commercial responsibilities. Elvis was torn. His heart leaned toward Ann, but his obligations and the pressure to marry Priscilla pulled him in another direction. Their relationship nearly derailed everything. When Priscilla found out about the affair, she threatened to leave. For a moment, it seemed like Elvis might follow his heart instead of his handlers. But ultimately, he ended things with Ann-Margret to avoid more scandal. And just like that, what could have been the real love story ended in silence. But Anne never betrayed him, not once. "There are some things too sacred to talk about," she said after his death. Their romance was brief, but it left a lasting mark. She remained a loyal friend, sending flowers to his grave every year. Ann-Margret loved him not for his fame, but for the boy behind the myth. And Elvis, in private letters, always called her Thumper, his nickname for her, long after the cameras stopped rolling. While Ann-Margret quietly stepped back, Priscilla stepped forward, into the aftermath of Elvis's chaos, and into a power she never expected to hold. Priscilla, after Elvis. After her divorce, Priscilla Presley faced a world that still saw her as Elvis's wife, a beautiful ornament frozen in time. But she was determined to write her own story. Left to raise Lisa Marie in the shadow of an American legend, Priscilla chose not to run from the Presley name, but to build something from it. She took charge of Elvis Presley Enterprises and transformed Graceland into one of the most visited private homes in the world. For years, the estate had been bleeding money. Priscilla made bold moves, licensing Elvis's image, opening Graceland to the public, and branding the legacy in a way no one expected from a woman who had once been kept in the background. "I had no idea what I was doing," she admitted in an interview, "but I knew it had to be done." Within years, she turned a bankrupt estate into a multi-million-dollar business. Romantically, she never remarried. There were boyfriends, rumors, high-profile flings, but no second wedding. She said she still felt married to Elvis in some strange, unexplainable way. "Elvis was my first love," she said, "and there will never be another like him." Yet she learned to live without him, balancing memory with independence. From her role on Dallas to her elegant public appearances, Priscilla became her own brand, stylish, sharp, and respected. But she always kept a respectful distance from scandal. She walked the fine line between preserving the myth of Elvis and telling the truth about their complicated life. And in doing so, she became more than just the girl who waited. She became a woman who endured and evolved. But not every woman in Elvis's life left with power. Some stayed until the very end, watching him fade. And for one of them, love meant being a caretaker, not a queen. Linda Thompson. In 1972, a young beauty queen named Linda Thompson met Elvis at a private movie screening in Memphis. She was only 22, fresh-faced and intelligent, with a calm presence that stood in contrast to his chaos. Elvis was already unraveling, but Linda walked into his world like a steady anchor. What started as infatuation quickly turned into 4 intense years of caretaking, loyalty, and heartbreak. She moved into Graceland and stepped into the role no one saw, but everyone depended on. Linda became more than a girlfriend. She became his emotional nurse. She managed his moods, helped coordinate his meds, and tried to protect him from the people who enabled his addictions. She would later say, "He was surrounded by people, but incredibly lonely." Linda saw the cracks behind the crown. At night, she watched over him. During the day, she tried to hold the broken pieces of his life together. "I loved him very much," she said, "but I wasn't equipped to save him." Eventually, the weight of it all became too much. Elvis was slipping further into addiction, and Linda was sacrificing more than she could carry. She walked away in 1976, not out of anger, but out of sorrow. "Leaving him was the hardest thing I ever did," she said. "But staying would have destroyed me." Her departure marked the end of the last real effort to help him recover. After his death, Linda never cashed in on scandal. She honored their time together with grace, writing about him with tenderness in her memoirs. "He was a great love in my life," she said. But sometimes love isn't enough. And that truth, spoken softly, says more about her than any tabloid ever could. But just months after Linda left, another woman arrived at Graceland, young, starry-eyed, and unaware of what was waiting. She would become the last person to see Elvis alive. Ginger Alden. Ginger Alden was only 20 years old when she met Elvis Presley in 1976. He was 41, bloated, exhausted, and barely hanging on. Within weeks, he proposed. To the world, it seemed rushed, strange, maybe even staged. But Ginger saw a different side of him, a man desperately searching for redemption, a man trying, even if failing, to put his life back together. She later said, "He talked about the future constantly. He wanted to get better." Their relationship was a whirlwind of pills, promises, and paranoia. Ginger moved into Graceland, stepping into a surreal world of closed doors and quiet crises. She watched as Elvis cycled through moments of hope and collapse. One day he'd talk about touring again, she recalled, and the next he couldn't get out of bed. She was his fiancée, but also his audience, watching his slow disappearance in real time. On the morning of August 16, 1977, Ginger found him collapsed in the bathroom. He was already gone. "I screamed his name," she later wrote, "but I knew it was too late." In that moment, the man the world adored became the man who died alone. For decades, Ginger carried that image with her, while also carrying the weight of public scrutiny. Many blamed her, others dismissed her, but she never changed her story. Years later, she finally told her side in a memoir titled Elvis and Ginger. It wasn't a sensational tell-all. It was a quiet confession of love, confusion, and helplessness. "I was there," she said. "I loved him, and I lost him." Her voice, long ignored, became a crucial part of the Elvis story, because it came from the end of it. But not all the women in Elvis's life were famous. Some were whispered about, hidden in the shadows. Fling, fantasy, or real connection, these women revealed the side of Elvis few ever got to see. Mistresses, fling, and fantasy. Beyond the headlines and the marriages, there were the flings. The quiet companions, the Hollywood hookups, and the fantasies that never lasted long. Elvis dated a constellation of famous women: Natalie Wood, Sybil Shepherd, Connie Stevens, and Barbara Lee. For many, the experience was intoxicating, and then it was over. "He was magnetic," said one, "but once the spotlight moved, so did he." Being chosen by Elvis Presley came with its own kind of power and its own kind of pain. Many women were dazzled at first, only to realize they were part of a cycle. He could be charming, romantic, and childlike, but also distant, moody, and deeply possessive. Most relationships ended as quickly as they began. Some women said they never really knew where they stood with him. Others felt discarded, forgotten. Behind the scenes, Colonel Tom Parker had a heavy hand in Elvis's love life. Some women were strategically introduced or quietly pushed away. Parker controlled the image, and the image didn't include messy love affairs. Meanwhile, Elvis himself sought younger, often more submissive women, repeating a pattern of power imbalance that would define many of his private liaisons. He liked innocence, one ex-girlfriend recalled, but didn't know what to do with real emotion. Some of these relationships were just rumored, others were deeply personal, but almost all followed the same script: attraction, control, and distance. The myth of Elvis made real connection difficult, and for the women on the sidelines of history, the romance often felt more like a dream you wake up from, alone. From flings to fiancés, every woman had one thing in common: they were in love with a man the world thought it owned. But behind the gold records and flashing cameras, the weight of loving Elvis Presley was heavier than anyone could have imagined. Living with a legend. Loving Elvis wasn't just about being with a man, it was about sharing him with millions. Every woman who came into his life had to face the same truth. The world adored him, and they never stopped watching. Whether it was Priscilla adjusting to life under surveillance at Graceland, or Linda Thompson being shadowed by tabloid rumors, privacy didn't exist. One former girlfriend once said, "I didn't date Elvis. I dated a circus." Infidelity was a recurring wound. Elvis had a wandering heart, sometimes from boredom, other times from fear of real intimacy. His partners were expected to look the other way. Priscilla eventually confessed he wasn't faithful, not in the conventional sense. For women who loved him deeply, it became a game of emotional survival. They clung to the good days and ignored the rest. But every betrayal left a scar. Fame was the third wheel in every relationship. The entourage, the fans, the colonel, they all demanded pieces of Elvis. He gave the best of himself on stage, but often came home drained, irritable, or emotionally vacant. Women close to him described feeling like afterthoughts, praised one day, ignored the next. "It was like being in love with a ghost," Linda once said. He was there, but not always present. And after it all ended, whether by breakup or by death, the pain lingered. Many of these women didn't just lose a partner, they lost a version of themselves. The trauma didn't vanish when the lights went out. It stayed. In interviews, some couldn't speak of him without tears. Others, like Ann-Margret, chose never to speak much at all. Silence, in some cases, was the only way to mourn. But for Elvis, love wasn't always about affection. It was often about control. He didn't just want a partner. He wanted someone to shape, to mold, and sometimes to break. Love or possession? From the very beginning, Elvis had a specific image of love, and it was often rooted in control. With Priscilla, it was most visible. He chose her clothes, told her how to do her hair, and expected her to remain pure until marriage. She later admitted, "He molded me into the woman he wanted me to be." Then he resented it. For Elvis, love wasn't about equals, it was about building someone into his vision. He was drawn to innocence, but it came with contradictions. Once the women in his life became more confident or independent, he withdrew. He wanted mystery, but not confrontation. He loved attention, but hated vulnerability. This cycle played out again and again, from Priscilla to Linda to Ginger. As soon as the fantasy broke, he pulled away. He didn't want a partner, one woman said. He wanted an audience. There was a kind of emotional choreography in his relationships. Kindness followed by coldness. Passion followed by silence. He could be unbelievably generous one moment, gifting Cadillacs, diamonds, even houses, then distant and unreachable the next. For many women, it was emotional whiplash. They walked on eggshells, never knowing who they'd get each day. Elvis the lover or Elvis the jailer. Still, nearly all of them eventually broke free. Priscilla left to discover her own voice. Linda walked away to preserve her sanity. Even Ginger, the youngest and most vulnerable, reclaimed her truth years later in her memoir. For each, escaping meant more than leaving Graceland. It meant surviving the emotional hold of a man who was adored by the world, but couldn't fully love himself. And while love might have been painful, watching Elvis fall apart was even harder. Because for those who stayed, they didn't just witness the end of a legend. They witnessed the slow disappearance of a man they loved. Drugs, decline, and despair. By the mid-1970s, Elvis was no longer the agile, electrifying performer he had been. The sparkle was still there on stage, but backstage, things were unraveling. He was bloated, heavily medicated, and emotionally fragile. Linda Thompson saw it first. She watched him become more dependent on prescription drugs, unable to sleep, unwilling to admit he was slipping. He was slowly committing suicide, she later said, and no one could stop him. Elvis's mood swings became severe. One moment he'd be joking with his entourage, the next he'd retreat in silence or lash out in frustration. The women closest to him bore the brunt of it. Ginger Alden would later describe how unpredictable things became. He'd make grand plans, talk of marriage, children, comebacks, and hours later collapse into himself, numbed by pills and paranoia. His decline wasn't sudden. It was a slow, daily fade. Despite it all, Linda and Ginger stayed for as long as they could. They believed in the man behind the myth. They hoped that maybe, just maybe, he'd return to them. But addiction was the real mistress in his life. No amount of love could compete with the pharmacy in his bathroom. "I tried everything," Linda said, but in the end, he didn't want to be saved. On August 16, 1977, Elvis Presley died in the most tragic way imaginable. Alone, unwell, and surrounded by the very walls meant to protect him. For Ginger, the image of finding him on that bathroom floor never left her. For Linda, the grief came not from shock, but inevitability. They both saw it coming, and in many ways, that made it even harder to bear. The world only saw the glitter, the jumpsuits, the screaming crowds, the fame. But behind closed doors, Elvis wasn't the king. He was a man battling demons. And those closest to him carried the burden of watching him lose. The public versus private Elvis. To the world, Elvis Presley was the ultimate sex symbol, an untouchable icon of swagger and seduction. But behind the curtain, the man was often much different. Those closest to him saw not a rock god, but a deeply insecure soul. He needed constant reassurance, craved control, and feared being forgotten. As Linda Thompson once put it, the public saw power. I saw pain. The contrast between who he was on stage and who he was in private was so wide, it nearly broke the women who tried to bridge it. Many women described his complicated relationship with intimacy. Though idolized as a lover, rumors swirled that Elvis was uncomfortable with sex, especially after marriage. Priscilla revealed that their physical relationship faded after Lisa Marie was born. He began to view her as a mother figure, and it altered everything. He had to uphold an image of perfection, she said, and sometimes that image had no room for real closeness. Whispers of celibacy and distance weren't rare. They were echoed by several women who loved him. In many ways, Elvis remained emotionally frozen, stuck somewhere between boy and man. He clung to his mother's memory, idealized youth and innocence, and often avoided vulnerability. Women who tried to confront his moods or challenge him were shut out or pushed away. Ginger Alden said he struggled with emotional maturity and often retreated from conflict rather than face it. The man who mesmerized millions couldn't always meet his own reflection without discomfort. This tragic duality of Elvis the icon versus Elvis the man left his partners in an impossible position. They loved someone who didn't always know how to love back. They were with a man adored by the world, yet struggling to love himself. And in the end, they were left carrying the truth of a man who was both dazzling and deeply wounded. Yet even after all the heartbreak, these women didn't just walk away. In life and after death, they held on to his memory, each in their own way, shaping the myth of Elvis in ways the world never fully saw. Legacy through their eyes. Priscilla Presley became the keeper of the flame. After his death, she took on the impossible role of preserving the Elvis legacy while protecting their daughter and her own identity. She transformed Graceland into a global monument and turned the Presley estate into a thriving empire. But she did it with restraint. She rarely spoke bitterly about their marriage. "I still love him," she once said. "I always will. But I also had to learn to love myself." She became more than a widow. She became a steward of history. Ann-Margret, in contrast, chose quiet devotion. She rarely spoke of their affair, but sent flowers to his grave every year, never missing a birthday or anniversary. When she did open up, it was with careful reverence. "He was the love of my youth," she said softly in one rare interview, "and he stays with me." Her silence wasn't cold, it was sacred. She mourned him in the way only a few could understand. Linda Thompson used her voice to heal. In her memoir, she reflected on her time with Elvis with compassion, not blame. She described him as brilliant, troubled, and kind, a man at war with himself. "I saw the best and worst of him," she wrote, "and I loved him through all of it." Unlike some, she didn't shy away from the darker parts, but she made sure to keep his humanity intact. And then there was Ginger, the one who saw his final moments. For years, her version of events was questioned, ridiculed, or ignored, but she stayed firm. In Elvis and Ginger, she finally shared her truth, filled with affection, confusion, and sorrow. "He was planning for the future," she wrote, and then, suddenly, there was no future left. Each of these women, in different ways, became storytellers of his soul, guarding the man the world never really knew. But they didn't just carry his memory, they carried on. Each woman, marked by love and loss, had to find life after Elvis, and the strength to move beyond the shadow of the king. Life after the king. Priscilla Presley didn't just survive Elvis. She thrived. After his death, she stepped into the spotlight with grace, starring in Dallas, launching her own business ventures and becoming a powerful voice in managing the Elvis brand. But she never remarried. "There will only ever be one Elvis," she said. Her life became a careful balancing act between honoring the man and defining herself beyond him. Linda Thompson found her own kind of rebirth. She became an Emmy-winning songwriter, penning hits for Whitney Houston and Celine Dion. She also became a mother, raising 2 sons, including Brody Jenner, with quiet strength. Her career and life after Elvis were full, but she never erased the past. "I'll always love him," she said, "but I also had to love myself enough to leave." Ann-Margret kept dazzling. Her career endured, her spirit never dulled. but she never exploited her past with Elvis, even when it could have made headlines. She focused on her work, her marriage, and her own quiet dignity. People always asked, did she really love him? Her smile usually said more than her words ever did. Ginger Alden faced a different road. For years, she was cast as a controversial figure, the last fiancé, the one who found him dead. Public perception was often cruel, but in time, she found peace. She wrote, spoke, and finally allowed herself to be heard. "I didn't ask for this chapter," she said, "but I lived it. And I remember him not for how he died, but how he tried to live." Through the spotlight and the silence, through love stories and late-night heartbreak, each woman emerged with her own version of the truth. Together, they don't just tell the story of Elvis Presley, they complete it. They knew Elvis Presley not as a myth, but as a man, complicated, charismatic, and quietly broken. These women saw him at his most human, charming and childlike one moment, cold and unreachable the next. They watched the legend rise, and in many cases, fall. Priscilla preserved his name. Ann-Margret protected his memory. Linda and Ginger held his hand when the lights went out. And all of them, in one way or another, survived him. Each woman carried a version of Elvis with her, some in silence, others in memoirs, and a few with lifelong grief. But together, their stories paint the fullest portrait of who he really was behind the fame. Because in the end, the true story of Elvis Presley isn't just about the man who changed music. It's also about the women who loved him, lost him, and lived to tell the tale.